Hi everyone, so I'm back now doing the second part of the first week lecture. This is kind of a bit longer than what we'd normally be doing for a lecture throughout the semester, but because we're going to be working on methods for the rest of our time together, apart from what we do next week with Indigenous communities, it seemed to me like a good idea to kind of put in place some of the background, some of the framework, some of the thinking that needs to happen before you can even get out into the field and use a method in order to do your research. So a method is the way in which we gather the data that we're going to use, and for me it's the most fun part of doing any research. And an analogy that I like to use is that before we get on to the method or the painting of the room, there's a whole lot of preparation that goes on beforehand, a whole lot of thinking. And if that thinking isn't done very well, it's a bit like not preparing a room very well for the painting, then the final job won't be very good. And I'm embarrassed to say that I have painted a room without doing the adequate preparation. And you know that if you don't clean out the furniture, wash the walls, clear up the cracks, you end up with something that's not as good as if you've done all of the preparation. So think about the lectures for this week as setting us up for the rest of semester, really, in thinking through what we need to do, the mental preparation, all of the researching, thinking, building, planning before we go on to the fun bit, as far as I'm concerned, the method, collecting the data. So the basic elements of the research process is what we're going to be talking about for this part of the lecture. So that's the methodology, the standpoint, which our social position, epistemology, it also comes into it, axiology or theory of values, ontology or theory of being. These are all the things that I'm going to be talking about throughout this part of the lecture for week one. And then we come down to the social science paradigms, and the methods is kind of the last bit that we'll get to. But we're going to be spending quite a bit of time on that for the rest of the semester, so I'm not in the least bit bothered. So we're going to work through all of these, the what, the why, the how, the who you're going to be doing it with, the when, all of that, those questions are addressed by this word, methodology. Now, many people, it seems to me, confuse method, the procedure that we use for collecting data, with methodology, which is a much larger conceptual tool, I think, than just the procedure you're going to use. So, as I said, a method is the procedure we use to gather particular data, the fun bit. The methodology, though, is a much larger plan of action, taking into account a whole range of things that we need to be thinking about. So you can think about it as the strategy or the plan of action underlying the choice, the particular use of methods we've decided on, and linking that all together to the desired outcomes. So methodology, in my mind, is much larger than methods. We also need to be considering, and I think this is quite an important thing to consider, is our particular standpoint. So where the researcher stands in relation to others and in society. So it's going to be influenced by our particular gender, race, social class, politics, culture. So me as a woman, as a white woman, has quite a different standpoint, say, from example, a researcher coming from an Indigenous perspective, a researcher who's a male coming from an Indigenous perspective, or a female, social class. The fact that I come from a very poor background myself puts me in a different standpoint from another researcher who perhaps had quite a privileged upbringing. So all of that comes into our thinking, and all of that also, our standpoint is also influenced by epistemology, which is our theory of knowledge, our axiology or our particular values, or our ontology, the way in which we think about existence. So standpoint is part of, I think, the methodology, this larger question which will inform the way in which we will go about doing our research, and even it might inform the sort of research method that we choose as well. Epistemology is a large field of philosophical research and thinking, and I'm not really wanting to go into that. One, I'm not equipped, and two, I won't be able to do it justice in this time. What I wanted to do is just flag that I want you to be thinking about how you know what you know. Do you know what you know through lived experience, through time on this planet? Do you know what you know because it's been transmitted to you through the culture, the larger culture of Australia, or the smaller, the microculture of your particular family? Do you know what you know because it's been transmitted to you through books, through schooling, etc.? So that's kind of the very, very basics of this larger word, epistemology, and I'll leave it to you to explore in a bit more detail. But the point of putting it in here is that as far as we're concerned in talking about social research, there are kind of two main fields that it's worth knowing about. So the first main one is the idea of objectivism, that we can, as social researchers, be neutral observers of the social world, that we can be objective and free of bias, that the knowledge kind of exists out there quite independent of me, the individual researcher, that knowledge is separate even from my own experience or from your own individual experience. So a quote here that I like is that objectivity implies that the researcher can control the whole process of research and produce this neutral knowledge of social reality that's external to me, the researcher, and quite independent of me, the observer's observation. So just as the world turns, whether we know it or not. So that's kind of the idea of objectivism. So if you are coming from an epistemology or a theory of knowledge of objectivism, the way in which you might conduct research is to measure, to test some hypotheses, to do some predictions and have control groups, to generalise, to identify cause and effect. It is regarded as the scientific approach, and the methods include observation and experiments. The question I would like to ask you, is it possible for medical research done in this scientific way but funded by drug companies, could that produce knowledge which is objective or neutral or value-free, which is what objective means? I'll leave you to think about that. What I'd like to do is go on to talk about the other main epistemology or theory of knowledge. The other main epistemology or theory of knowledge that I wanted to draw your attention to is the idea of constructionism, because constructionism rejects the objectivist view of human knowledge. Instead, social constructionism refers to or believes that the socially created characteristics of human life are based on the idea that people actually construct or build or create reality, which means that it can't be either natural nor can it be inevitable. And in fact, for many feminists, for example, it's seen as the most positive view of the way in which we can think of the social world in particular, because if things aren't natural and inevitable, then we can make changes. So therefore, concepts such as gender shouldn't be taken for granted. There is room for manoeuvre there to make some shifts. And if you think about history, of course, I think that's where you can see social constructionism in action, because if things have been different in the past, then things can be different in the future, and therefore the way the world is not inevitable. So constructionism tends to use more qualitative approaches to research, and the focus, therefore, is more on how people create meaning, how people are constructing their own reality. It's not always seen as scientific, and research is not usually generalizable, so you can't take a particular theory, therefore, and apply that to the entire population. So if one group of people tell me that university education for them is not particularly helpful, that tells me about that particular group. It doesn't tell me about everybody who goes to university, for example. So the methods include, because we're focused on meanings, the methods include interviews, focus groups, participant observation. Now, I might as well be out with it. I am a social constructionist, so I do think that we create the social world, and therefore my favourite sort of research method tends to be qualitative research, and I don't see it as less scientific or less valid or less rigorous than other types of research. But you can see when you put the two together how understanding your theory of knowledge, your epistemological framework, how that will inform the sorts of research that you do and even how you talk about it. So going back to our basic elements of the research process, I wanted to mention this word axiology. That's our theory of value. So a theory of value, for example, might be that being very honest is an important value for many people, and that might override taking care of people, because sometimes in being honest we might be hurtful. So it's about how we all think about our particular values and then how we bring those to our research. So if what I value is honesty and integrity above all else, then that will inform the way in which I will talk about my research to other people. It will certainly inform the way that I'll keep records of my research. It shapes everything. You know, again, if I have a value of respecting other people, that comes into the ethics of the way in which I will conduct research and make sure that I'm respectful of other people. But it's not just the individual researcher, it's also the values of particular research institutions. And for example, at the University of Adelaide, one of our core values is to have integrity is very central to our research. So we would question doing research, drug companies paying researchers to do research for the university. So we'd question that. Doesn't mean to say we'd say no, but we'd certainly want to analyse what will happen to those results. Is it possible to do that research and not have the research outcomes corrupted in some way by the finances that are involved? Another basic element of the research process has to do with ontology, which is our theory of being or existence. And some people have a theory of existence, for example, that we're on this earth for a short time, there's only one life, and that's it. At the end of when we die, that's it. Contrasting to some people who have a view of life that there's a continuation past death in the form perhaps of a soul or a thought process or energy. So that's two contrasting theories of being, and that might shape and inform the way in which we do research as well. A Celtic community, people originating from Scotland and Ireland, have an idea of reality that there's a very thin veil between people living in what we understand as living and people who've passed over to another side of life through what they might see as the portal of death. So that's kind of a theory of being. Again, this is a very large area of philosophical research. I'm just mentioning it because how we see the world, how we think of reality, does shape the way in which we do research. Coming now to some social science theories or paradigms or models. There's a number of these: the functionalist perspective, conflict, interpretivist, feminist, indigenous, postmodernism. All of these are contained with a little paragraph, bit of more information on these perspectives in your textbook. Now, the first of these is functionalism, which is a little bit out of date these days, but it's important that you at least be aware of it. So it was the dominant sociological paradigm through the mid-20th century, so from the late 19th century. It was developed by an American by the name of Talcott Parsons, and you'll still see his work in sociological texts. It starts with the basic question, how is social order possible? And most of the time, if you think about it, society does work quite well, although, of course, we've had some notable examples recently with terrorist attacks, which suggest that it's not working so well in some parts of the world. The answers are usually in terms of stability and social order, and this idea that somehow we're all consenting to a particular way of living in the social world. So that's probably one of the reasons why it's not particularly popular these days. Another reason is that it tends to explain society by comparing the social world to a biological entity. So, for example, explaining thinking about the social body as being analogous to the human body. So, and if you think about it, you can kind of see how that might work, because most organisations do have a CEO or a head. So you can think about that as analogous, and then you work your way down, and there's some people right at the bottom of society and various organisations. So perhaps it's not totally out of whack, interestingly. However, I guess where it doesn't always fit well with me is that it tends to suggest that there's some sort of objective or inherent or natural reasons for the particular social norms and values that we do have. And as I've already said, I come from a constructionist point of view, so for me that doesn't work quite so well. However, still used, you'll still find social science researchers using this, and I guess it comes within that objectivist scientific sort of framework. Conflict perspective is the next one that I want to talk about, and this is associated with Karl Marx. It sees social relationships usually based on exploitation of one group and another group being oppressed, and then conflict between those two groups. As I said, based on Karl Marx's ideas, where he was mostly focused on economic struggles between the working classes and the capitalist or the owners of the means of production. The contemporary application of this conflict paradigm actually extends beyond economic oppression. That's a little bit too narrow. So there still are social struggles going on around, class and ethnic divisions, for example. And perhaps one example is the kind of cultural wars that you might see mentioned between, and just one example of the idea of Australia, whether it was settled or whether it was invaded. So you can see that that is a conflict, struggles between groups with quite different points of view on the one topic, but not necessarily solely to do with economic interests. So it's a little bit, the way in which this is seen today is a little bit broader than what Karl Marx saw. However, it does still begin from the idea that society is inherently unequal and that there is ongoing conflict between groups as groups compete from different places, different standpoints over resources and power relationships. Tends to examine the social world in terms of the question of who benefits and who's being disadvantaged. And it does provide rather a big picture or macro perspective of society or a very large social group. So we can have a look at this from the perspective of Australia and class, for example. And you would do that from that large level, or you could even take it out even further and look at it from a global level as well. And that stands in contrast to an interpretivist point of view, which is much more focused on the micro or the small level. So this concentrates on the individual agency and the way we interrelate and interact in society as individuals. Developed by another 19th century man, Max Weber, who was a German sociologist. And it emphasises the meanings that we, called variously individuals or actors or agents or subjects, but that we give to our social interactions, and the use of symbols, language is a symbol, in the creation of meaning as well. From this point of view, the human world is not objective, it is a world of meaning, and we can understand that, and we do that at the micro level. So We want to talk to individuals, we want to talk to families, we want to talk to small groups, focusing on how people make meaning and how they interpret social life and how they help to construct social reality as well. Usually associated with qualitative social research methods, for example, in-depth interviews where we go and ask individuals how life is for them. A feminist perspective was developed to counteract very much a male-centred approach to the study of the social world, because up until the 1970s, women were largely ignored in the social sciences, both as researchers and also as research participants or subjects. Women's differing experiences of social reality, therefore, were largely invisible in the mainstream social science research and theory, and I would say beyond that as well in medical research and theory as well. Coming from a feminist perspective, then gender is fundamental. It's fundamental to the way in which you go about doing research, and it's also often seen as a fundamental division in society as well, a fundamental way in which society is structured or ordered. There are a number of feminist paradigms. There's not one single perspective. If I just name two, you could be a radical feminist from the 1970s, or you might be a liberal feminist from the 1970s or today as well. Liberal feminists tend to be those who is kind of the public face of feminism in a way, where the argument is for equal opportunity and equal rights before the law. And I don't disagree with any of that. If you're coming from a radical perspective, a radical feminist perspective, then much of their emphasis was on male violence against women, whether that was in the home or whether that was around sexual violence. So two different perspectives, not completely overlapping and not completely different either. However, there are only two. There are many other ways in which feminism is conceived of as well. Therefore, there's no single feminist approach to social research either. But really, if you're coming from a feminist perspective, that is going to shape the sort of social question that's formed. It will be interested in the gendered nature of the way in which society is structured, and it's likely to inform the way in which the topic is defined too. Very often associated with qualitative research methods, very much in the frame of the interpretive methods that I spoke of before, but not necessarily. However, often there is memory work and life histories, etc., that's been done. And I've done one of those fairly recently, a feminist memory work project with women students from Flinders University who were studying social sciences out there, but who came from poor and working class backgrounds. And that approach, feminist memory work approach, was to have the women write their stories about their educational experiences, and then they and us analysed those stories in a larger group afterwards. So they were both participants in the research project, but also part of the analysis of the research as well. An Indigenous perspective does direct the question. We'll be doing more on this in week 2. It certainly informs the choice of methods, the way of studying, and what's valid and valued as knowledge. It does challenge many of the traditional Western ways of thinking about approaching social research, and I think that Western research could learn from Indigenous ways of doing things as well. These research techniques need to admit these days Indigenous agendas and Indigenous community interests. But it's more than that. It's not just admitting them. It's actually working in a way that changes the power relationships. So if I'm thinking about participatory action research, where the power is no longer centered solely with the researcher, but also with the researched. And so there's very much an ongoing dialogue and interaction between the research participants and the researcher. You'll hear more of that in week 2. Postmodernism, struggling with the pronunciation of that word, associated with some French philosophers, and kind of seems to me a natural progression if I think about the way in which knowledge is conceived of, very much a social constructionist way of thinking about it, that reality is a very subjective experience. It is entirely constructed. Therefore, because of the diversity of people in the world, the social reality, the way in which we experience it and construct it, is very fragmented, very diverse, and necessarily all human knowledge and experience is relative. No absolute values or truths because of this. It does raise, not that I'm opposed to postmodernism at all, not at all, but it raises kind of an interesting social research dilemma. If all reality or social phenomena is subjective, then in terms of thinking about social research and looking at patterns, is there any point in doing that? Just a question to be thinking about. We're finally down to methods. So methods, if I use my painting analogy, is the fun bit. This is where I get to slap the paint on the walls, having done lots of work beforehand. The methods, and this is what we're going to be talking about all semester, the methods are the techniques or procedures that are used to gather and analyse data so that you are answering some sort of research question or testing an hypothesis. Lots and lots of different research methods, measurements, questionnaires, statistical analysis, on the other side, focus groups, life histories, narratives, lots and lots of different ways of doing things. So I just want to stress that methods is your way of actually gathering data, but there's a whole lot of preparation that you've done beforehand to be thinking about your methodology, your own standpoint, whether you're going to be doing constructionist research, whether that's your epistemology or theory of knowledge, or whether you're going to be doing more objectivist. So what I want to do is just make clear here the difference between methodology and methods. And methods, as I've said, past week 2 is what we're going to be focused on in this course. So ethnography, for example, is a methodology. It's used by anthropologists, involves a whole range of methods, including participant observation, interviews, material analysis, which is an analysis of things, listening to people's life histories. So one is broader than the individual sorts of methods that you'd be using. So back to my point before that some people confuse those two. Methodology is not a method, but methodology includes methods. Another example is discourse analysis, and you're going to be doing some of this for your final assignment. It's an analysis of texts. Survey research, again, is a methodology that involves a range of methods, including measurements, taking questionnaires, and doing some sort of statistical analysis. So, just to sum up, there is politics involved in research, and we might as well have that up front and not pretend or deny it. I think it's very important. In understanding the philosophical theory of knowledge, or what I've been calling epistemology, even though we've done it very crudely, really, and very briefly, we can begin to think about all of the assumptions that we bring to the research project. And I think it's important to consider those, bring them out, have them on the table, because it does shape the way in which we do research, and therefore, of course, it's going to shape those results that we get from the research as well. And finally, when we're thinking about methodologies and also methods, it pays to remember that it's not just about convenience or expediency. It's actually a reflection of ways of thinking about the world, particularly our epistemologies, whether we do come from a position of seeing the social world as out there and independent and social norms as natural, or we're a social constructionist, as I've said I am, where human beings are actively involved in constructing social reality. So it's far better, I think, to have all of that out in the open and be thinking about it. And from my perspective, it doesn't matter which of those perspectives you come from, as long as you're aware of it and aware of what it all means. So if you're still with me at this point, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in workshops in week 1. Thank you.